You don't know humiliation until you've been ordered to scrub the banquet hall floors for a mating ceremony you're explicitly forbidden to attend. The mud on my knees wasn't the worst part. It was the fact that Kalen, the man who once swore we were pack above all, was the one who banned me. I was supposed to be invisible tonight, a forgotten Omega rotting in the root cellars. But the Alpha King of the North didn't miss a thing, especially my absence. The lye soap was chewing through the top layer of my skin. I kept my head down, letting the stiff bristles of the brush do the talking against the ancient, grease-stained flagstones of the keep's kitchens. Above me, the castle was a living, breathing beast. The ceiling groaned under the weight of hundreds of boots. Tapestries were being unfurled, dust raining down in slow, lazy spirals through the shafts of pale afternoon light. Tonight was the Alpha's mating ceremony. Tonight, Kalen was binding himself to Cecily of the Eastern Ridge. And tonight, I was banished to the damp, lightless belly of the keep to ensure I didn't ruin the aesthetics of their perfect, blood-soaked union. "You missed a spot by the hearth, Nora." A voice grunted. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. It was Bram, the head of the kitchen guard, a grey-muzzled brute who survived 3 border wars only to end up babysitting the packs unwanted. "I'll get it," I muttered, dragging my bucket across the stones. The water sloshed over the rim, grey and murky, mirroring my mood. I wasn't always a pariah. There was a time, before the ceremonial scars, before the politics of bloodlines and territory, when Kalen and I ran the pine forests together. We were pups then, all sharp teeth and reckless abandon, stealing smoked venison from these very kitchens. He wasn't the Alpha back then. He was just the second son, and I was the bastard daughter of a disgraced scout. We were the runts, the leftovers. Then his brother died in a skirmish. His father succumbed to the winter rot. Suddenly Kalen was thrust onto the pelted throne, and the boy who used to patch up my scraped knees was replaced by a man who couldn't look me in the eye. The banishment had been delivered 3 days ago. Not by him, of course. He didn't have the spine for it. He sent Cecily's personal envoy to deliver the message. "The Alpha requests your absence from the Great Hall on the eve of the binding," the envoy had said. His nose wrinkled, as if my very scent offended him. Lady Cecily feels the presence of unranked blood might disrupt the sacred harmony of the rites. You will remain in the lower levels until the king's retinue departs. Sacred harmony. What a load of absolute garbage. Cecily was insecure. She smelled the history on me whenever I walked into a room. She hated that I knew Kalen before he wore a crown of woven iron and wolf teeth. She hated that I knew he used to cry when the winter storms got too loud. Banning me wasn't about sacred rites. It was about erasing the parts of his past she couldn't control, and Kalen let her do it. A heavy vibration shuddered through the floorboards, rattling the copper pots hanging from the ceiling hooks. The kitchen staff froze. Even Bram straightened his spine, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. "They're here," a scullery maid whispered, dropping a basket of onions. The king's retinue. King Ronan didn't travel light. He ruled the northern territories, a sprawling, brutal expanse of ice and jagged mountains where wolves were born with frost in their lungs. He was the apex, the alpha of alphas. Kalen's entire reign depended on Ronan blessing this mating tonight. If the king found the union weak, he could strip Kalen of his title with a single word. I paused my scrubbing, sitting back on my heels. I could feel the arrival in my bones. It was a primal, heavy weight pressing down on the keep. A scent began to drift down the stone corridors, cutting through the overwhelming odors of roasting boar, spilled wine, and wood smoke. It smelled like crushed pine needles, like ozone right before a lightning strike, cold, sharp, absolute. "Get moving, all of you!" Bram barked, shaking off the momentary stupor. "The king will want meat the second he steps off his horse. Nora, finish that floor and get down to the root cellar. You know the orders. I don't want a single hair of your head visible above ground level." I wiped a streak of sweat from my forehead, leaving a smear of grey soot across my skin. Don't worry, Bram. I have a date with a sack of rotting turnips. I wouldn't dream of crashing Kaelin's party. Bram sighed, his gruff exterior softening for a fraction of a second. It's not right, Nora. You're Pack. You should be in the hall tonight. I'm not Pack, I corrected, standing up and wringing out the heavy wool cloth into the bucket. My hands were red, raw, and aching. I'm a ghost, and ghosts belong in the dark. I grabbed my bucket and turned toward the narrow, winding stairwell that led to the sub-cellars. As I descended, the air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient masonry. I could hear the muffled roar of the courtyard above, the clashing of armor, the neighing of massive destriers, the collective, submissive whine of our Pack's wolves greeting their king. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the root cellar and let it slam shut behind me, sealing myself in the pitch black. I struck a flint against the stone wall, lighting a single, sputtered tallow candle. The flame flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the mounds of burlap sacks. I sat down on an overturned crate, pulling my thin shawl tighter around my shoulders. I was alone. Banished. Forgotten. Let them have their feast. Let Kaelin smile and drink his wine and pretend he was a king in his own right. I didn't care anymore. The cynical part of me, the part that kept me alive all these years, knew that mating ceremonies were nothing but political theatre anyway. It was all a grand performance, and I was glad I didn't have to buy a ticket. Or so I told myself, as I sat in the dark and listened to the distant, thumping rhythm of the ceremonial drums beginning to beat. The root cellar smelled of sprouting potatoes, wet dirt, and isolation. It was a heavy, suffocating scent that clung to the back of my throat. I had spent the last 4 hours sorting tubers by the dim, sputtering light of my single candle. The bad ones I tossed into a wooden bin. The good ones went back into the burlap sacks. It was mind-numbing work. The kind of work meant to break your spirit, or at least keep it distracted. Upstairs, the world was ending and beginning all over again. I could hear the drums. They started as a low, steady thrumming that resonated in the marrow of my bones, a heartbeat vibrating through the stone foundation of the keep. Thump, 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 the ancient rhythm of the binding rites. Every time the drums picked up pace, dust would shake loose from the ceiling planks, drifting down like dirty snow to settle on my hair and shoulders. I ignored it. I kept my hands moving, letting the repetitive motion numb the tight, burning sensation in my chest. I wasn't jealous of Cecily, I wasn't. But I was mourning the final, definitive death of my only friendship. By accepting this banishment, Kaelin had finally severed the last frayed thread between us. We were nothing now. The drums reached a frenzied peak. I stopped sorting and wiped my filthy hands on my apron. This was it, the climax of the ceremony. The moment Kaelin and Cecily would slice their palms, press their blood together, and the Alpha King would howl his blessing, cementing their union in the eyes of the ancestors and the law. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back against the damp stone wall. I waited for the roar of the pack. I waited for the floorboards above to shake with the collective, deafening howl of 300 wolves celebrating their alpha. I waited and waited. The drums stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, wrong. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling. The complete absence of noise was more terrifying than any battle cry. There was no cheering, no howling, just a suffocating stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My inner wolf, usually dormant and suppressed by years of harsh discipline, stirred uncomfortably, scratching at the inside of my ribs. Something was terribly wrong. 10 agonizing minutes passed. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, hurried footsteps, pounding down the stone spiral staircase. They weren't the rhythmic boots of a standard patrol. They were frantic. The heavy iron latch of the cellar door lifted with a loud clack. and the door swung open, hitting the stone wall with a violent thud. The sudden influx of torchlight blinded me. I threw a hand over my eyes, squinting through the glare. Bram stood in the doorway. He was panting, his face pale beneath his greying beard, his chest heaving against his chainmail. He looked terrified. I had seen Bram face down a charging bear without blinking, but right now the man looked like he was staring at the executioner's block. "Nora!" he gasped, his voice tight. "Get up." I didn't move, my heart kicking into a faster rhythm. "What's wrong? Did the hunters attack? No!" Bram snapped, stepping into the cellar and grabbing me by the upper arm. His grip was bruising, pulling me off the crate so fast I stumbled. "It's the king! The Alpha King!" "What about him?" I demanded, planting my feet and refusing to be dragged. "Bram, stop! What is going on?" Bram turned back to me, his eyes wide and frantic. He stopped the ceremony. Kaelin and Cecily were at the altar. The blood was drawn, but when it came time for the blessing, the king held his hand up. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. "Why?" "Because he said the pack was incomplete," Bram whispered, looking over his shoulder as if the shadows themselves were listening. "He said he could smell a tear in the tapestry. He demanded the pack registry. He demanded to know who was missing." My breath hitched. "No. Yes," Bram said grimly. Kaelin tried to lie. He said a few sentries were on the borders, but King Ronan wasn't asking about sentries, Nora. He looked straight at Kaelin and said, "Where is the one who smells like rain and rust? Where is the wolf you hid in the dirt?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands, still covered in potato dirt, began to tremble. "He can't mean me. I'm a nobody, Bram. I'm unranked. The king doesn't care about Omegas." "He cares today," Bram said, giving my arm another harsh tug. "Kaelin is shaking like a leaf. Cecily is in tears. The king refuses to proceed until every single member of this pack is standing in the Great Hall. He sent his personal guards to search the keep. If they find you down here hiding—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The king's justice was swift and brutal. "I look like a beggar," I whispered, looking down at my soot-stained dress, the frayed edges of my sleeves, the mud caked onto my boots. I wasn't dressed to stand before the most powerful man in the continent. I was dressed to rot in the dark. "It doesn't matter," Bram said, his voice softening just a fraction, though the panic remained in his eyes. "You have to come now, Nora, or Kaelin loses the crown, and the king might just slaughter the lot of us for the insult." I swallowed hard, tasting fear and dirt. The girl who scrubbed floors was begging me to run deeper into the cellars. But the wolf inside me, the battered, cynical, deeply buried wolf, suddenly bared her teeth. They wanted me invisible. Now I was the only thing stopping their perfect night from burning to the ground. "Fine," I said, my voice hardening into something cold and steady. "Let's go ruin a wedding." The climb up the spiral stairs felt like ascending to an execution block. My legs were heavy, the wet wool of my dress clinging to my shins. With every step, the distant sounds of the great hall grew louder, but it wasn't the noise of a celebration. It was the frantic, murmuring hum of a panicked hive. Bram walked half a pace behind me, his hand resting lightly near the hilt of his sword. Not to guard me from threats, but to make sure I didn't turn and run back into the dark. He didn't need to worry. My pride, buried deep under years of dirt and subservience, was finally cracking through the frost. If Kaelin was going to drag me into the light to save his own neck, he was going to have to look at what he made me. We reached the oak doors of the great hall. 2 of the king's personal guards flanked the entrance. They were massive men, clad in black iron armor forged in the unforgiving forges of the deep north. Their eyes, a chilling, pale amber, tracked me as I approached. One of them wrinkled his nose, catching the stench of root rot and lye soap that clung to my skin. But neither made a move to stop me. Bram nodded to them. The guards shoved the heavy doors open. The heat of 1,000 candles hit me first, followed immediately by the suffocating scent of expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. The great hall was packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite of our pack and the visiting northern lords. 300 wolves dressed in silk and dyed furs, adorned in silver and gold. And yet, the silence was absolute. No one was eating. No one was speaking. 300 pairs of eyes snapped towards the doorway the second the hinges groaned. I stepped over the threshold. My muddy boots left thick, dark prints on the pristine, white-woven runner that led straight up the center aisle to the dais. The crowd parted instinctively. They pulled their expensive cloaks back, pressing against the long wooden tables to avoid brushing against me. Some looked disgusted. Others looked terrified. I kept my chin level, refusing to shrink. I walked the gauntlet of my own pack, listening to the wet squelch of my boots echo off the vaulted stone ceiling. At the end of the hall, the dais was arranged for a binding. A massive altar of black marble sat in the center. Calen stood behind it, wearing a ceremonial tunic of woven silver thread. His left hand was extended, a deep gash sliced across his palm. Fresh blood dripped steadily from his fingers, pooling on the marble surface. He looked exactly like the boy I used to know, pale, wide-eyed, and completely out of his depth. Beside him stood Cecily. She was breathtaking in a gown of crushed red velvet, her dark hair woven with pearls. But her beautiful face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was glaring at me with a hatred so dense I could practically feel it scraping against my skin. And then there was the king. King Ronan sat in a heavy, high-backed chair positioned to the right of the altar. He didn't look like a man attending a wedding. He looked like a warlord resting between slaughters. He wore no crown, just a thick mantle of black wolf fur draped over dark leather armor. He was older than Calen, his face weathered and brutally sharp, scarred by ice and teeth. His eyes were a stormy, unforgiving grey, and they were fixed entirely on me. The primal weight I had felt down in the cellar was radiating from him in suffocating waves. My inner wolf, usually a beaten, quiet thing, scrambled to the surface, scratching frantically at my ribs. She wanted to drop to her knees. She wanted to bare her throat. The urge to submit to the apex predator in the room was a physical ache behind my knees. I locked my joints, digging my fingernails into my raw, aching palms. I would not bow, not here, not in front of Calen. I stopped 10 paces from the dais. The silence dragged out, heavy and expectant. "Well?" King Ronan finally spoke. His voice wasn't a shout, but it carried effortlessly through the cavernous hall. It was a low, rough rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It seems the rats in this keep are quite bold. Calen swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "My king," he stammered, stepping forward, careful to keep his bleeding hand away from his pristine tunic. "This is a misunderstanding. The girl she is an Omega, a kitchen servant. She holds no rank within the pack registry. There was no need to present her for the binding rites. I did not ask for the pack registry, Alpha Calen," Ronan said lazily, shifting his weight in the heavy chair. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The casual movement made half the guards in the room tense. "I asked for the pack. Is she not of your bloodline? Does she not carry the scent of these woods?" "She is a bastard!" Cecily spat, unable to contain herself. Her voice was shrill, shattering the quiet tension. "She is the disgraced offspring of a traitor. She doesn't belong here, King Ronan. She was ordered to remain below." Ronan didn't even look at Cecily. He kept his slate-grey eyes locked on my face. A bastard, a traitor's blood, and yet she is the only one in this room who doesn't smell like fear. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely terrifying. He was massive, standing a full head taller than Calen. The northern lords in his retinue instantly stood straighter, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. Ronan walked down the 3 short steps of the dais, his boots making no sound on the stone. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator closing in on a cornered deer. Calen opened his mouth to speak, to intercept, but a single, sharp look from one of the king's guards snapped Kaelin's jaw shut. I held my ground as Ronan stopped barely 2 feet in front of me. Up close, the scent of crushed pine and ozone was intoxicating. It cleared the stench of the hall from my lungs, sharp and clean. He looked down at me, studying the soot smeared across my forehead, the frayed, damp wool of my dress, the dirt caked under my fingernails. I stared back, refusing to drop my gaze to his collarbone as pack law demanded. If he was going to execute me for disrespect, he could do it while looking me in the eye. "You smell like rain," Ronan murmured, his voice dropping to a register meant only for me. "And rust. And defiance." "I smell like lye soap and rotting potatoes," I replied flatly. A collective gasp echoed through the front rows of the great hall. Behind me, I heard Bram make a small, choked sound in his throat. Speaking back to the Alpha King with anything less than absolute reverence was a death sentence. Kaelin looked like he was about to faint. Ronan's eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through his stoic expression. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. It was the baring of teeth from a wolf who had just found a fight worth having. "Tell me your name, Omega," he commanded softly. "Nora," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. "Just Nora. I don't have a family name." "Because your father was a traitor?" he asked, tilting his head. He was close enough that I could see the faint, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Because my father was a scout who told the old Alpha a truth he didn't want to hear," I corrected, my tone sharpening. "He died for it, and I was stripped of rank to pay for his honesty." "Nora!" Kaelin barked from the dais, his voice cracking with panic. "Hold your tongue! You address the Alpha King! You will show him your throat and beg his forgiveness for this insolence!" Ronan didn't turn around. He didn't even shift his gaze from my face. He simply raised one large, scarred hand, flicking his fingers dismissively towards the altar. "Silence, boy." Kaelin choked on his next word, his jaw clicking shut. The insult was brutal. Calling an alpha boy in front of his own pack was a complete dismantling of his authority. Cecily let out a small, furious hiss, her face flushing crimson. Ronan took a half-step closer to me. The heat radiating from his large frame was intense. The urge to submit flared again, stronger this time, a primal instinct demanding I recognize his dominance. My knees trembled, betraying the iron will of my mind. I forced myself to lock my legs tighter, my fingernails cutting crescent moons into the dirty skin of my palms. He saw the struggle. He saw the violent war happening beneath my skin. He leaned in, lowering his head until his lips were inches from my ear. "You are fighting your own nature, little wolf," he whispered, the rumble of his chest vibrating through the narrow space between us. "Why?" "Because submission got me a bucket and a damp cellar." I whispered back, my voice barely audible over the roaring in my own ears. "I'm done kneeling." Ronan inhaled deeply, the sound slow and deliberate, drawing my scent into his lungs. My breath hitched. It was a wildly intimate gesture, one reserved for mates or closely bonded pack members. In front of 300 people, the Alpha of Alphas was scenting a disgraced Omega. When he pulled back, his grey eyes were entirely black. The human was gone. The wolf was sitting right behind his pupils, watching me with a possessive, terrifying intensity. "Alpha Kaelin," Ronan said, finally turning his head to look back at the dais. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was the sharp, cracking sound of ice breaking over a deep lake. "You presented your pack to me for the binding rites. You swore on the blood of your ancestors that your house was in order, that your ranks were unified." Kaelin looked wildly between Ronan and me, the bleeding gash on his palm forgotten. "My king, she is nothing. She is a stain on the keep. I kept her hidden to honor the purity of the ceremony. Lady Cecily requested—" "I do not care what Lady Cecily requested," Ronan interrupted, his voice dropping like an anvil. He turned fully towards the altar now, I care that you lied to your king. I care that you fracture your own pack to appease a bruised ego. An alpha who hides his own people in the dark because he lacks the spine to manage them is no alpha at all. Cecily stepped forward, her velvet gown rustling aggressively. Protocol be damned, she was losing her perfect night, and her vanity couldn't take it. She is unranked. She has no wolf. She hasn't shifted in 5 years. She is practically human, King Ronan. You cannot halt a sacred binding for a kitchen rat! Ronan's head snapped toward her. The sheer force of his glare made Cecily stagger backward as if she had been physically struck. Careful, little bird. Ronan snarled softly. Do not speak to me of sacred bindings when you stand at an altar built on cowardice. He turned back to Kaelin, who was now clutching his bleeding hand against his chest, looking completely, utterly defeated. The power dynamic in the room had shifted violently. Kaelin was the alpha of this territory, but in this moment he was nothing more than a pup being scolded by an elder. The blessing is denied, Ronan declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, final and absolute. A shockwave ripped through the hall. Gasps, murmurs, and quiet whimpers broke out among the crowd. A denied blessing meant the mating was invalid. It meant Kaelin's hold on the territory was officially challenged by the crown. It was political suicide. Kaelin dropped to one knee. My king, please. We have drawn the blood. The ancestors watch. I will exile the girl tonight. I will remove her from the territory so she no longer offends the— If you touch a single hair on her head, Ronan said, his voice dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper, I will rip your throat out with my bare teeth and let my hounds feast on your remains. The hall went dead silent. You could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Ronan turned his back on Kaelin, dismissing him entirely, and looked down at me. The black had receded from his eyes, leaving that stormy, calculating grey. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently gripping my chin. I flinched, expecting a strike, but his touch was surprisingly light. He tilted my dirty face up to the light, studying me like a map he had finally decoded. She doesn't belong in the dark. Ronan said softly, entirely to himself. Then, louder, addressing the silent, terrified hall. She belongs to the north. She belongs to the north. The words didn't echo. They dropped like stones into a stagnant pond, the ripples tearing apart everything I knew about my miserable, predictable life. I jerked my chin out of his grip. It wasn't a polite, calculated movement. It was the feral, defensive flinch of a stray dog expecting a kick. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, beating so hard I was certain the entire hall could hear it. I took a step back, my dirty boots scraping against the pristine white runner. I belong to no one, I said. My voice trembled, betraying the brave front I was desperately trying to maintain. A collective gasp rippled through the hall again. 2 of the king's guards stepped forward, their hands dropping to their heavy broadswords. Ronan didn't flinch. He didn't look offended. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, a stormy sea completely devoid of waves. He raised a single hand, stopping his guards in their tracks. You belong to the dirt, then? Ronan asked, his voice low, lacking the theatrical boom he had used on Kaelin. To the root cellars and the lye soap. You claim no one, yet you let a boy in a silver tunic dictate how much air you are allowed to breathe. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I had no answer for that. The truth was an ugly, jagged pill. I had survived by making myself small. I had survived by letting them bury me alive. My king, Kaelin pleaded from the floor, his voice cracking. The silver tunic suddenly looked entirely too big for him, a child playing dress-up in his dead father's armor. Take her. Take her as tribute. Take her as a servant. But please, the ceremony. The ancestors require the binding. My pack requires stability. Ronan didn't even grant Kaelin the dignity of turning around. Your pack requires a leader, Ronan said to the stone wall. Not a politician who bleeds on an altar of convenience. The binding is halted. I will return to the north. If you survive the winter without my protection, perhaps I will reconsider your claim to this territory in the spring." Cecily let out a wail that bordered on a shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing Kaelin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fine silver thread. "You can't do this! You are ruining everything over a mutt, an unranked, wolfless mutt!" "One more word," Ronan growled, the vibration shaking the dust from the rafters. "And I will take his head instead of his pride." Cecily clamped her mouth shut, her eyes wide with absolute, suffocating terror. Kaelin stared at the floor, the blood from his cut hand pooling in a sticky, dark circle on the white fabric. He didn't look at me. Not once. The boy who used to steal venison with me in the pine forests was dead, and I was finally, truly looking at his corpse. Ronan turned his attention back to me. "Walk." It wasn't a request. It was an absolute command, laced with an alpha's compulsion that hit the base of my spine like a physical weight. My inner wolf whimpered, demanding I follow. I turned on my heel and walked. I didn't look at the faces of the pack members as I passed them. I didn't look at the disgust, the pity, or the fear. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Bram was standing by them. As I approached, the grizzled old guard didn't say a word. He just reached out, grabbed my dirty, raw hand, and gave it a single, firm squeeze. A silent goodbye. A silent good luck. Then I was out the doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a bucket of freezing water. The courtyard was chaotic. The king's retinue was already moving, sensing their alpha's command before it was even spoken aloud. Stable hands scrambled to saddle massive destriers. Armor clanked. Orders were barked in the harsh, guttural dialect of the deep north. A massive black warhorse was brought forward. Its breath plumed in the cold air, stamping a hoof against the cobblestones. Ronan walked past me, grabbing the reins. He didn't bother with a mounting block. He simply hauled his massive frame into the saddle with terrifying ease. He looked down at me. I stood in the mud, my damp wool dress clinging to my freezing legs. I had nothing. No cloak, no belongings. Just the dirt on my skin and the bitter cynicism in my chest. "Are you going to make me tie you to the saddle?" he asked, extending a heavily leathered hand down toward me. "I don't know how to ride a warhorse," I muttered, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to crash, leaving me hollow and freezing. "You don't need to know how to ride," he said, leaning down slightly. "You just need to know how to hold on." I hesitated. I looked back at the keep. The massive stone walls loomed against the night sky, a monument to a decade of my suffering. It was a cage. But stepping onto that horse was stepping into the dark. I was trading a familiar prison for an unknown executioner. My fingers were numb as I reached up. His grip was entirely engulfing. He didn't pull me up so much as he simply lifted me with one arm, swinging me up and settling me sideways in front of him on the saddle. The heat radiating off his chest was immediate. He smelled intensely of the wild, pine, crushed ice, and the metallic edge of a drawn sword. He snapped his heavy fur mantle off his shoulders and threw it over me. The fur was thick, heavy, and completely saturated with his scent. It swallowed me whole. "Move out," Ronan commanded. The column of heavy cavalry surged forward. We rode out of the iron gates, the hooves of 100 war horses thundering against the drawbridge. I didn't look back. I buried my face in the coarse black fur of his mantle, closing my eyes as the freezing wind whipped around us, carrying me further and further into the dark. We rode for hours. The jarring rhythm of the horse ate away at the last of my adrenaline, leaving me hollowed out and aching. The northern retinue moved with a terrifying discipline. There was no idle chatter, no rowdy singing, no passing of wineskins like the border patrols in Kaelin's territory. They were a silent, moving wall of iron and muscle, chewing up the miles under the light of a pale, sickle moon. I remained stiff against Ronan's chest. The urge to lean back, to absorb the furnace heat of his body, was overwhelming. My dress was still damp from the lye water, freezing against my skin beneath his heavy mantle. But my cynicism kept my spine rigid. I wasn't going to cuddle up to the warlord who just hijacked my life to make a political point. I was a prop, a pawn used to humiliate a lesser alpha. The moment my usefulness expired, I'd likely be tossed into a snowbank. "You are going to snap your own spine trying to avoid touching me!" Ronan's voice rumbled abruptly, vibrating through the saddle. "I'm perfectly fine." I lied through chattering teeth. "You are shivering so violently the horse is confused." He replied dryly. Without asking permission, a heavy arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. I gasped, stiffening, but it was like fighting a stone wall. The heat was instantaneous. It seeped through my wet wool dress, thawing the ice in my bones. My inner wolf gave a pathetic, contented sigh, curling up in the back of my mind. I hated her for it. "Don't!" I snapped, trying to pry his arm off. "I'm not one of your submissive little court pets." "Clearly," he muttered, his grip tightening just enough to lock me in place. "If you freeze to death on my horse, I will have to explain to my men why their alpha dragged a corpse out of the southern keep. Suffer the warmth, Nora. It's not a proposal." I stopped fighting, largely because I lacked the physical strength to continue, and mostly because the warmth was entirely too good. I let my head drop back against his leather armor, glaring into the dark woods blurring past us. Sometime before dawn, the command to halt was given. We had reached the edge of the borderlands, where the pine forests began to thin, giving way to the jagged, rocky foothills of the north. The camp went up with brutal efficiency. Tents were pitched, picket lines for the horses were strung, and fires were roaring before I had even managed to coax my numb legs into supporting my weight. Ronan practically dropped me off the horse. I stumbled, my boots sliding in the mud, catching myself on a wooden wagon wheel. I expected to be dragged to a prisoner's tent or shackled to a tree. Instead, a young guard, hardly older than I was, with bright red hair and a scar across his nose, approached me with a bundle in his arms. "My lord requested you take these, lady," he said, bowing his head respectfully. Not the mocking, sneering bow of Kaelin's men. It was a genuine show of deference. I stared at him, bewildered. "Lady? Dry clothes," he added quickly, misinterpreting my shock. "And a water skin. There is a tent set up by the eastern fire for you." He shoved the bundle into my arms and practically ran away, clearly terrified of lingering near the Alpha's prize. I found the tent. It wasn't a prisoner's pen. It was a thick canvas pavilion lined with heavy furs. A small iron brazier burned in the corner, radiating heat. I dropped the bundle on a cot. Inside was a tunic of dark, woven wool, thick leather leggings, and a heavy cloak lined with grey rabbit fur. They were men's clothes, clearly meant for someone much smaller than Ronan, but far better quality than anything I had worn in a decade. I peeled off the filthy, damp servant's dress. The lye soap had left my hands red and cracking, and my knees were bruised black and blue from the flagstones. I scrubbed my face clean with a damp cloth from the water basin, watching the water turn murky brown. When I emerged from the tent, dressed in dry wool, the camp was quiet. Most of the men were sleeping in shifts. Ronan sat alone by a large fire on the edge of the camp, a whetstone scraping rhythmically against a massive broadsword. I didn't want to go to him. I wanted to crawl into the furs in the tent and sleep for a week. But I needed answers. I wasn't going to be dragged across the continent blindly. I walked over, my boots crunching on the frost-hardened grass. I stopped on the opposite side of the fire. The flames cast dancing, jagged shadows across his scarred face. "Why am I here?" I asked, skipping all protocol. He didn't look up from the blade. "Shak! Shak!" The whetstone slid over the steel. "To ensure you didn't spend the rest of your life sorting rotten potatoes." "Don't patronize me," I said, my voice hardening. "You don't care about a Southern Omega. You wanted to break Kaelin. You wanted to humiliate him in front of his lords, and I was the most convenient weapon in the room." Ronan stopped sharpening the sword. He set the stone aside and rested the massive blade across his knees. He finally looked up at me. The slate-grey eyes were calculating, stripping away my defensive anger. "You think highly of Kaelin's importance to me," Ronan said softly. "I could have broken him by blinking. I could have snapped his neck on that altar, and his lords would have thanked me for saving them the trouble of overthrowing a weak alpha." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Then why?" "Because," Ronan said, leaning forward, the firelight catching the feral edge in his eyes, "when I demanded the pack registry, I wasn't looking for political leverage, Nora. I was looking for the scent that has been driving me insane since I rode into that miserable keep." My breath hitched. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my throat. "No, that's a myth. That's a story told to pups to keep them romantic and obedient. Is it?" Ronan murmured. He stood up, towering over the fire. "Your wolf has been silent for 5 years, dead to the world. Tell me, Nora, is she silent right now?" She wasn't. She was howling, scratching at the cage of my ribs, desperate to cross the fire and press her throat to his hands. I backed away. The crunch of my boots on the frost sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet camp. "Mates," I said, the word tasting like bitter ash on my tongue, "are a myth. They are a political tool invented by alphas centuries ago to justify stealing women from neighboring territories." Ronan let out a low, rough laugh. It wasn't a mocking sound. It was the genuine, rusted chuckle of a man who rarely found things amusing. "You have a remarkably bleak view of the world, Nora. I have an accurate view." I countered, crossing my arms tighter across my chest. The rabbit fur lining of my borrowed cloak was warm, but the chill inside me had nothing to do with the weather. I spent the last 10 years scrubbing floors for a man who used to share his winter rations with me when we were pups. I watched him trade loyalty for a crown and a vicious bride. So, forgive me if I don't believe in magical, unbreakable bonds dictated by the moon. Ronan didn't step closer. He didn't try to crowd my space or use his massive frame to intimidate me into agreeing. He just stood by the fire, letting the flames cast long, dancing shadows across his battered armor. "I don't believe in magic either," he said, his voice a steady, grounding rumble. "I believe in blood. I believe in instinct. My wolf recognized yours the second you walked through those oak doors. He recognized the fight in you. That isn't a fairy tale, Nora. It's biology. Biology can be ignored." I snapped. "It can." He agreed easily, surprising me. "You can spend the rest of your life fighting your own nature. You can keep your wolf locked in a cage until she starves to death. I won't force a bond on a woman who looks at me like I'm a jailer holding a new set of keys." He turned back to the fire, picking up his whetstone and resuming the rhythmic scraping against his broadsword. The dismissal was jarring. I was so used to Kaelin's volatile ego, to the constant, suffocating need to manage an alpha's temper. Ronan simply stated his truth, accepted my defiance, and went back to his chores. "Go to sleep, Nora," he murmured, not looking up from the steel. "We cross the spine tomorrow. The air gets thin, and the ride will break you if you aren't rested." I stood there for a long moment, staring at the broad line of his shoulders, waiting for the trick, waiting for the demand. It never came. I turned and walked back to my tent, my mind a chaotic, tangled mess. The next morning broke grey and brutal. The cold was a physical entity, biting at any exposed skin. The camp was dismantled with terrifying efficiency. Tents vanished, fires were smothered with dirt, and horses were saddled before the sun even breached the horizon. When the red-haired guard, who I learned was named Aemon, approached to lead me back to Ronan's warhorse, I planted my feet. "I want my own mount," I said. Aemon looked panicked. He shot a nervous glance toward the front of the column, where Ronan was adjusting the girth on his saddle. "Lady, the king ordered. I don't care." I interrupted, keeping my voice level. "I am not riding in his lap like a prized trophy. Find me a horse, or I'll walk to the north." Aemon swallowed hard, clearly weighing the wrath of his king against the stubbornness of a crazed southern woman. Before he could decide, a heavy set of footsteps crunched up behind me. "Give her the roan mare," Ronan ordered. I spun around. He was standing a few feet away, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a faint glimmer of approval in his slate-grey eyes. "She has a hard mouth and a mean temper," Ronan told me, his gaze dropping to the heavy wool cloak I had pulled tight around my neck. "If you fall behind, we will not stop to wait for you." "I won't fall behind," I said. They brought me the mare. She was a thick-barreled, ugly beast with a scarred flank and a foul disposition. She snapped her teeth at Eamon when he handed me the reins. I grabbed the leather, swung myself up into the saddle, and drove my heels into her sides before she could think about bucking. She pinned her ears back, let out a snort of annoyance, but fell into line. We rode for 3 days into the mountains. The landscape changed from the familiar, towering pines of my home into a brutal, jagged wasteland of black rock and perpetual ice. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying a biting sleet that coated our cloaks in a layer of frost. It was agonizing. My thighs were bruised purple from the saddle, my hands were cracked and bleeding despite the leather gloves, and my lungs burned with every breath of the thin, freezing air. But I didn't complain. I didn't ask for a halt. I kept my head down, matching the grueling pace of the northern cavalry. I spent hours watching Ronan. He led from the front, a massive, unmovable anchor in the storm. I watched how his men interacted with him. There was no groveling, no fearful hesitation. They rode up beside him to share a water skin or report a scout's findings, speaking to him with the blunt, rough camaraderie of soldiers. They respected him not because he demanded it with threats, but because he endured the exact same hardships they did. He didn't ride in a carriage. He didn't demand extra rations. It was a stark, jarring contrast to Caelan, who held court like a spoiled deity, terrified of his own people. On the 4th evening, as we made camp beneath the shadow of a massive frozen waterfall, my mare stumbled on a patch of black ice. I went down hard, my shoulder slamming into the frozen earth. Before I could even drag myself upright, a shadow fell over me. Ronan reached down, his large hand gripping the thick wool of my tunic. He hauled me to my feet in one smooth motion, his eyes scanning my face for injuries. "I'm fine," I snapped defensively, brushing the snow off my knees. He didn't let go of my tunic. He pulled me slightly closer, his gaze dropping to my cracked, bleeding lips. "You are entirely too stubborn for your own good, little wolf, but you didn't break." He released me, turning to grab the mare's reins. As he walked away to tie her to the picket line, my inner wolf slammed against my ribs, howling a frustrated, aching sound of pure longing. I squeezed my eyes shut, cursing the traitorous animal in my chest. The fortress was not built. It was carved. We cleared the final mountain pass as the pale afternoon sun struggled to break through a canopy of heavy grey clouds. Below us, nestled in a deep, sprawling valley surrounded by jagged peaks, lay the northern stronghold. It was a massive, brutalist structure of dark iron and grey stone, merging seamlessly with the rock of the mountain itself. There were no decorative banners, no woven tapestries hanging from the battlements, just iron spikes, heavy siege weapons, and the smoking chimneys of 100 forges. "Welcome to the Krag," Eamon muttered from atop his gelding, his breath puffing into the freezing air. He looked exhausted, but there was a distinct, proud gleam in his eyes. As the cavalry column descended the winding, treacherous path into the valley, the scale of the settlement became clear. It wasn't just a keep. It was a sprawling, fortified city. The outer ring was a labyrinth of stone houses and bustling markets. Even in the bitter cold, the streets were packed with people. We rode through the massive iron portcullis. The sound of our arrival drew a crowd. I stiffened in my saddle, preparing for the whispers. In the south, an unranked wolf riding with the alpha would have triggered a storm of vicious gossip, pointing fingers, and cruel laughter. I braced myself for the disgusted looks, but as we rode through the main thoroughfare, the reaction was entirely different. The northern pack didn't cower or whisper. They stopped their work, blacksmiths lowering their hammers, merchants pausing their haggling, and pressed their closed fists over their hearts in a silent, powerful salute to their returning king. Ronan nodded to them, acknowledging the respect without the arrogant pageantry Kaelin required. They looked at me, of course. A strange woman riding a bruised roan mare, wearing clothes 3 sizes too big, surrounded by the king's personal guard. But their eyes held curiosity, not malice. They noted my unranked scent, but there was no immediate judgment. In the north, it seemed, survival mattered more than bloodlines. We dismounted in the central courtyard of the main keep. My legs were so numb I nearly collapsed when my boots hit the cobblestones, but I forced my knees to lock, refusing to show weakness. Stable hands rushed forward to take the horses. Ronan tossed his reins to a waiting boy and turned to face the heavy wooden doors of the keep. They swung open, and a small delegation stepped out. Leading them was an elder. He was built like a battered oak tree, wide and scarred, with a thick mane of silver hair and one milky, blind eye. He wore heavy furs and leaned heavily on a polished iron staff. This was a man who had survived a century of brutal winters. "You return early, Ronan," the elder said. His voice was like grinding stones. He didn't use the title king. "The southern borders are weak, Torin," Ronan replied, closing the distance and gripping the elder's forearm in a warrior's greeting. Kaelin plays at being an alpha. He bled on an altar to bind himself to a woman who smells of perfume and panic. Torin snorted, a plume of steam escaping his nose. Southrons. They care more for the polish of their boots than the sharpness of their teeth. His good eye drifted past Ronan, landing squarely on me. He took a long, slow breath, tasting the air. His silver eyebrows drew together in a harsh, judgmental line. "And what is this? Did you take a prisoner, or did you find a stray dog wandering the borderlands? She smells like dirt and stale fear." The courtyard went entirely still. Eamon, standing a few feet to my left, sucked in a sharp breath. The guards shifted uncomfortably. Ronan didn't defend me. He turned slightly, crossing his arms over his chest, and watched me. He was waiting. This was a test. The North did not respect things that were handed out. They respected what was fought for. If I cowered, if I looked to the Alpha King to shield me from an elder's insult, I would be nothing more than a pet in their eyes forever. The exhaustion weighing on my bones vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. 10 years of swallowing insults, 10 years of biting my tongue while Cecily and Kaelin treated me like a disease. I stepped forward. I didn't bow. I didn't lower my eyes. "I smell like the dirt I was forced to scrub," I said, my voice ringing clear and sharp against the cold stone walls. "And if you smell fear, old man, it's only because I'm terrified of dying from boredom listening to you complain." A shocking, absolute silence stretched over the courtyard. Torin stared at me, his good eye wide with disbelief. My inner wolf, dormant for half a decade, suddenly clawed her way to the surface. I didn't suppress her. I let my eyes flash amber, baring my teeth in a subtle but unmistakable challenge. I was unranked. I was small, but I was done kneeling. Torin's jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second I thought the elder was going to strike me with his iron staff. Instead, a booming, rumbling laugh erupted from his chest. It echoed off the walls, genuine and loud. Torin slammed the base of his staff against the cobblestones, his face breaking into a wide, scarred grin. "By the ancestors," Torin barked, looking at Ronan. "She has no meat on her bones, but she has the jaw of a wolverine. Where did you dig this one up?" "Under the floorboards of Kaelin's keep," Ronan said. A faint, proud smile touched the corners of his mouth. Torin walked up to me, moving with surprising speed for a man with a limp. He didn't bow, but he offered his forearm. "Welcome to the crag, little wolverine. We are short on soap. But we have plenty of meat. Let's see if we can put some weight on you before the snows lock us in." I looked at his extended arm. It was a gesture of equality, a greeting of a pack member. I reached out, gripping his thick forearm, feeling the calluses and scars beneath my fingers. "I'll take the meat," I said quietly. Ronan stepped forward, his presence immediately dominating the space once again. "Eamon, take the men to the mess hall. Rest. Torin, I want a council meeting at sundown. The southern pass needs to be reinforced." He turned his slate-grey eyes to me. The test was over. I had survived the gates. "Come, Nora," Ronan commanded softly. "It is time you saw the inside of a keep from above the ground." The interior of the crag was nothing like the keep I had left behind. Kaelin's halls were designed for pageantry. They were draped in delicate silks that caught the dust and filled with hollow echoes. This place was built for survival. The walls were thick, insulating against the bitter cold, lined with the pelts of bears and mountain cats. Massive hearths roared in every common room, casting a heavy, golden warmth that finally seeped into the marrow of my frozen bones. There was no overwhelming stench of expensive, imported perfumes. The crag smelled of burning cedar, hot iron from the deep forges, and roasting meat. It smelled like life. Ronan didn't lead me toward the lower levels. Every step we took was upward, climbing a massive, spiraling staircase carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. "Where are we going?" I asked, my boots heavy on the stone. "To the upper wards," he replied, not looking back. "You need a hot bath, a hot meal, and a bed that isn't a mound of burlap sacks." I stopped on the landing. The sudden halt made him pause a few steps above me. He turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "I am unranked," I stated, the old cynical defense mechanism kicking in. It was a reflex. I had been conditioned to know my place, and my place was never above the ground floor. "I don't belong in the upper wards. Put me in the kitchens. Let me earn my keep. If you put me in a noble's chamber, your people will resent it. They will think you brought back a southern pet." Ronan descended the steps slowly, closing the distance until we were on the same level. He looked down at me, his grey eyes devoid of the harshness they held for his enemies. "Did Torin look like he thought you were a pet?" he asked softly. "Torin is one man," I countered. "Torin is the voice of the elders. His respect is harder to win than mine." Ronan reached out. I braced myself to flinch, but I didn't. He didn't grab my arm or my chin. He gently took my right hand. He turned my palm upward, running his calloused thumb over the raw, cracked skin, the heavy calluses born from years of scrubbing stone, and the thin, faded white scar across my lifeline. A remnant of a punishment for dropping a tray of wine glasses when I was 16. "My people do not care about southern ranks, Nora," Ronan said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the narrow stairwell. "They do not care about bloodlines or politics. They care about strength. They look at your hands, and they do not see an omega. They see a survivor. They see a woman who was buried alive and refused to suffocate." He released my hand, though my skin burned where he had touched it. "You will not scrub floors in this keep," he continued, his tone shifting back to the Alpha's absolute authority, but lacking any cruelty. "You will not hide in the dark. You will eat at my table. You will sleep in the upper wards. If anyone questions your place here, they answer to me. But I suspect, after meeting Torin, they will be too afraid of your jaw to say a word." A sudden, sharp sting hit the back of my eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming, crushing weight of validation. For a decade, I had been told I was nothing, a stain, a mistake. This warlord had looked at the exact same dirt and seen iron. I swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down. "Fine, but I am not wearing these oversized leathers to dinner. I look like a child playing dress-up." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I will have Eamon find you something fitting." He turned and continued up the stairs. I followed, my chest feeling lighter than it had in years. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door bound in black iron. He pushed it open, revealing a chamber that made Kaelin's quarters look like a servant's closet. A massive fire was already blazing in the hearth. A large wooden tub sat in the center of the room, steaming water waiting inside. The bed was enormous, piled high with thick furs and woolen blankets. "This is my adjoining chamber," Ronan said, standing in the doorway. He pointed to a smaller door on the far wall. "That leads to my quarters. I will leave it locked from your side. You have my word." I looked at the locked door, then back at him. The cynicism in me looked for the catch, the hidden cost. "Why give me the key?" I asked quietly. "You dragged me across a frozen continent. You claimed me in front of 300 people. Why give me the choice to lock you out?" Ronan rested a heavy hand on the doorframe. The firelight caught the jagged scar through his eyebrow. "Because a caged wolf will only ever resent her captor," he said, his voice entirely bare of pretense. "I didn't bring you here to be a prisoner, Nora. I brought you here to be my equal. Take a bath, lock the door, sleep for a week if you need to. When you are ready to stop fighting me, you know where to find me." He stepped back into the hall and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The latch clicked, sealing me inside the warmth. I stood alone in the center of the massive room. I looked at the steaming bath, the mountain of furs on the bed, and the solid, heavy door that led to the Alpha King's quarters. My inner wolf stretched, a deep, contented rumble vibrating in my chest. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to hide. I walked over to the adjoining door. I touched the heavy iron lock. I didn't turn it. I left it unlocked. And then, for the first time in 10 years, I finally let myself rest. Nora finally found a place where her scars are a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. But the peace of the Northern Crag won't last forever. Kaelin's humiliated ego and Cecily's vicious vanity are a dangerous combination, and the South will not let an insult from the Alpha King go unanswered. War is brewing on the horizon. Will Nora and Ronan's fragile new bond survive the coming storm? If you loved this dark, gritty tale of vengeance and fated mates, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the explosive next chapter.